So what I will try and summarize here is the work of years and years, and there are papers on it that if your interest should be aroused, and if you want to read further, then there are papers, including most recently in the Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, and International Relations of the Asia Pacific. Those three papers, but specifically two of them that I will be drawing on today. My title's In Between India and China, Bhutan's International Relations. And as you all know, Bhutan is a small, by the way, I should probably ask, has anyone here been to Bhutan? Okay, all right. We might also speak about that a bit later in the Q&A. So Bhutan is a small country in the eastern Himalayas, and already if I define Bhutan as small, mountainous, in between India and China, then I'm not just telling you where it is on a map, I'm also at the same time tracing a particular account of how we locate Bhutan on the map. So that in-betweenness of Bhutan, the fact that it is in between India and China, in other words, in between a small country between two larger powers, tends to be the most exhaustive way and often the sole way in which Bhutan is defined. And in my work, I challenge some of that and interrogate how we came to looking at it like this. Nobody ever says where's Switzerland, and nobody ever says Switzerland is just only this country that is between this country and this country. So this is a very specific way of viewing this particular country. Now the India-China relations have been marked, as you know, by various kinds of threats. They have often hostility along a long shared border. There has often been a demonstrable ineffectiveness of big power diplomacy in bringing about conciliatory understandings in spite of the increasing volumes of trade between them. And this is something interesting, that the volume of trade and the economic relationship between India and China has changed dramatically over time, but correspondingly Bhutan's relationship continues to be overwhelmingly with India and not with China. And Bhutan's relationship with China, it has consistently been seen as a threat from the Indian perspective. So Bhutan is mapped as in between in a way that is quite exhaustive but also quite asymmetric, in that the idea is that Bhutan is naturally oriented southwards, that it was always remote, mountainous, isolated, and its only natural relations could ever have been southwards, and I'm going to, the story that I'm telling is that even before the Chinese annexation, the Chinese annexation of Tibet in the middle of the 20th century, even before that part, and even before the 1962 India-China war, even before that, Bhutan's this was not just something that came from it. There was a conscious process of geopolitical fashioning that created and later naturalized the fact that Bhutan is oriented southwards, and it's not just just neutrally in between. I'm arguing for an overarching subaltern geopolitical perspective, where I'm saying that we have to look at how the longer imperial and post-colonial history of this in-betweenness has an effect on both our geopolitical understanding, but also in the knowledge making that is available to us on Bhutan. And by doing this, I'm saying we can look at the indigenous aspects of Bhutan's own foreign policy beyond the friendship with India and threat from China, which are the two main ways in which it gets seen. And therefore that Bhutan is not just a passive placeholder of great power politics, but it has its own dynamics that are important. Bhutan typically studied via Buddhist religious histories or via anthropology, and in my work I'm trying to trace the link between the interests over time, which are variable, and the economic interests have played an important part, the imaginaries that are, I would argue, constructed and shifting but naturalized, and the kind of the role of retrospective projections, in this case the in-betweenness. Now I think I should also summarize some of the actual detail that I have on this. Bhutan was, I don't know how much historical detail I need to give this audience, but Bhutan was the founder of Bhutan came from Tibet in 1616. Bhutan Challenges, it has a monarchy. Now it has a Westminster variant of parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarchy as of the last just over 10 years. Its monarchy is not a divine right monarchy. It was established in 1907, partly also with British support. It challenges the contrast between monarchy and modernity, and also things like the Huntington dilemma, in that Bhutan has that the reverence for monarchy and has not decreased with the arrival of democracy. And the transition to democracy happened at a time when a referendum on the desirability of democracy would have failed. So democracy was led, the transition was led from the top rather than, and something that was widely feared by large numbers of the people as as an unstable system. It is also a country that has privileged what it calls gross national happiness as opposed to GDP, just GDP, as a criterion of welfare. It's a carbon negative country, a functioning Asian welfare state. It mandates that 60% of the country remain under forest cover in perpetuity, and that any future king has to retire at a certain age, and no confidence motions can be initiated in the monarch, etc. So there are a kind of wide number of things that are important to note here. The asymmetrical thing is important, and the reason I'm questioning it, and in the presence of a historian, of course, I want to go a little bit into the history aspect of it. So, for instance, in 1947, at the Asian Relations Organization conference, Bhutan's representative there defined the country as we're perched high up in the Himalayas. In contrast to this, almost every single work of scholarship in Bhutan talks about it being wedged, sandwiched, nestled, located, etc., landlocked between India and China. And that continues to shift. It's either between, so this is a small country between, it used to be India and Tibet, and then it is the idea that this is between a democratic India and a communist China. So I'm really tracing a longer history in my work of this in-betweenness and saying that this isn't natural. It has been created over time. Bhutan has, in fact, gone from being seen as north of Cooch Behar, which was a state at the time, in the 1760s, 1770s, when James Rennell went exploring, to being seen as south of Tibet, when George Bogle went with his mission to Tibet via Bhutan, to in between Assam and Nepal trade routes to Tibet for Bengal from Warren Hastings onward, to in between British India and an impenetrable Tibet in the 19th century at the time of native exploration, to in between India and great game territory of Tibet and beyond from Young Husband onwards at the start of the 20th century, to in between India and Tibet from mid-20th century, to in between India and China from 1950s onwards, and now to in between landlocked between a democratic India and a communist China from 1960 onward. In each, so there isn't even one in-betweenness. Before India and China had unified themselves as countries through their own nationalist struggles, there was this country, and the fact that it continues to be, it got defined as this in-between place was determined by a whole series of economic motives that in the first phase, from the 1760s, 1770s to the mid 19th century is a phase that is about commercial interests. So and after that, from the mid-19th century to the start of the 20th century, that in-betweenness gets constructed through production interests as tea cultivation gains ground, and Bhutan's southern, what were known as the most fertile regions, Assam Duars and Bengal Duars, end up being coming under British control and taken from Bhutan, to the security interests that play a role up until the second part of the 20th century in the post-colonial period. And what often strikes me is the various rationalizations, but often also the continuities between the imperial and post-colonial periods in how this works. The standard story that I challenge, and I will very briefly summarize here, is that 1772 the British come to know about the existence of Bhutan. And that is because Bhutan and Cooch Behar had a dispute, and the British were forced to intercede, and that's how they got to know of it. In fact, Young Husband explicitly states as much. This is not true. It's simply not empirically true. The British, even though any number of books on Bhutan begin the study from the period 1772. Empirical work, of which I have cited here, and perhaps we can go into greater detail here, shows us that there were a wide variety of other factors, and that the British interest in Tibet was not a consequence of that's something that they had to do for Bhutan, but actually it preceded that. And the reason for that, of course, is one, the bankruptcies that the company was facing, and their need to push up north, which was explicitly stated in the letters as such. Accounts of, for instance, Renal already having known of the existence, plus other written letters that say that the British knew that Bhutan existed. So this is a very particular imperial story that is told, which is that we just didn't know Bhutan existed. It's only when the Bhutanese started misbehaving that we got to know that they even exist. So if you think about a whole range of things, and in the writing of this, that I came across that are not directly kind of the focus here, but if you think about the 1766 White Mutiny that the company soldiers were engaged in, this was a very difficult time, and also a time that led to this, and that led to the first treaty that was signed in the 1770s, in 1774, which was a consequence of Bogle's mission, which was then followed by several other missions over the years, in fact quite intensively up until the 1780s, and then by another mission in the second decade of the 19th century, which was led by, again, not a lot of people seem to have remarked on this, the person we know of as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who's spelled differently, but he was one of the, so this was one of the native-led missions, this mission. So there's that, and then there's the Pemberton mission in 1837, 1838, and then eventually we get to the mission that everyone knows about, or everyone who knows about Bhutan knows about, which is the 1860s Eden mission. And so again, in the second phase that I'm talking about, the idea is that Eden was treated badly by the Bhutanese, who humiliated him, and as a result, Britain and Bhutan fought a war in 1864-65, and as a result, the remaining territories were taken from Bhutan. That is manifestly challengeable because even before Eden mission, there were continuous suggestions that this land is fertile. I mean, not just from Bogle's time about tea cultivation, which was initiated by the 1820s, but also if we get to 1850s. I mean, there's even some reference, and this I would want to actually read further work on. I don't think it exists, or if it exists, I'd like to know of it, of the links between the 1857 situation in India and the Bhutan scenario, because at least in some references I found the idea that the Bhutanese stance towards the mutiny in India played a role in how in the fact that the hostilities escalated between Bhutan and Britain. I found very scant references, but I think this is something that is interesting. We think about the travels of some of the figures in the region at the time, and so in this second phase, what happens? And again, I think that it was interesting and also surprising that nobody had remarked upon texts such as Beden's, which was this, Beden was an ally, an administrator for Eden, who ends up quite simply stating the rationale for the 1865 treaty, which was a really important treaty, by the way, which treaty said that, that basically we would take this region and we would give them a subsidy, and we wouldn't give them a share of the revenue but a subsidy. It's also, I think, partly what is epistemologically interesting is the certainty creation that's happening. Certainty about mapping geographical frontiers, certainty about establishing accounting relationships between different entities, about what exchange rate should be used for tributes at that time. So there's all of these kind of growing pincers of certainty creation in which Bhutan comes to be seen as a certain, as this entity which is located in between this particular thing that we desire, or this thing that it is obstructing us from. Sorry to sound a bit vague here, but there's just too much detail, and I only have, I don't know how many more minutes. 5 more minutes. Okay. So
feel free to take longer. Actually, they're here to listen to you talk. So
no, or maybe you can ask me like questions, sure, and I can then expand on. Right. So yes, that is always a struggle. Like, how do I get? So anyway, so Beden is actually saying that this land is at least 1.5 lakhs. If we give them 25,000, and if we keep that as a yearly thing at a fixed rate, then we can keep increasing the value of the land. They don't know that the value really will be increasing. We'll get other people from other regions, mostly from people they thought were not, and this kind of also had a role in what became the southern problem. We'll move populations of people who are suited to cultivating to these regions and do a lot of tea cultivation, and that's what happened. And it kind of shaped not just the it really shaped the geography of that region, but also the inheritance in that region of political allegiances and identities, because then the population of the borders of southern Bhutan as well as of southern Bhutan was then shaped by this moved population. And so you have the ethnic strife that we see in Bhutan especially in its southern regions towards the end of the 20th century has its roots going way back in time. Anyway, so then this subsidy relationship was also useful in terms of ordering political allegiance and in making sure that there were competing elites who could be drawn upon in case of any problems. And this was also a period of time leading up to between 1865, and I think this is also personally fascinating, but between 1865 and 1907. So the idea officially, of course, is that there was no contact between Bhutan and Britain in that period, like no important people visited. That's obviously not true. I mean, apart from the Young Husband expedition, because there were other explorers and others who did go by. But the person who fought the British in this Anglo-Bhutanese war, his son ends up being the first. Jigme Namgyal in the 19th century, his son Ugyen Wangchuck ends up being the first monarch of Bhutan when monarchy is established. And Ugyen Wangchuck and his friend Ugyen Dorji are two significant figures in the Young Husband that assist the British at the time of the Young Husband expedition. There's also like that role of the big change that happens between the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So then we have this treaty that is then revised in 1910. And this 1865 treaty that is revised in 1910. And the 1910 treaty, which was the Treaty of Punakha, continued to many of the provisions, but it did have one significant change, which is that Bhutan, the British agreed not to interfere in the internal affairs of Bhutan, and in return, Bhutan agreed to seek the guidance of Britain in the conduct of its external relations. And this treaty was signed on the 8th of January 1910. So it's actually like just weeks after what happens with the Chinese in Lhasa. And so this is like a foundationally important treaty. And in fact, the treaty also increases the subsidy to the sum of 1 lakh. And then when India becomes independent, India redoes this treaty, which now becomes the Indo-Bhutanese Treaty of Friendship, and friendship is this consistent trope. So the treaty with India, the 49 treaty, that treaty has carries over that provision that now it has to seek the advice of guidance of India, and it increases the subsidy, and that treaty stays in force, including through the period when Bhutan becomes part of the UN, and until 2007, when just prior to the transition to democracy, that itself is an interesting thing that they coincide, just prior to the transition to this democracy, that treaty gets updated to remove that clause, this specific clause about its about the conduct of its external relations. In the third phase, in the phase from up until from early 20th to the late 20th century, in that phase where India is the most important actor, and Bhutan continues to have a status anxiety stemming from its encounter with varying imperial powers not just Britain but also India later, and the role of frontier political officers is important, who often end up emulating what had happened in the British era. But one key dynamic in that region is the sourcing of materials from Bhutan versus from Indian states. And through some of the archival work and that I look at, I show how there are competing possibilities, and the officers actually talk amongst themselves in their note amongst themselves in their files about, we have to, even if it's more expensive, we have to give this concession to Bhutan, because we have to orient the economy of Bhutan towards Indian economy and link it with India, because that's how it has to happen, even if that means prioritizing Bhutan over other Indian states. And they are also, of course, always noting how Bhutan is, in their words, poor but touchy about its status. They don't up until so the idea that Bhutan was remote, isolated, never had trade links up with anyone is also not true. I don't know if that comes across through so much of what I've been saying, but it simply isn't true that it's remote. It hasn't had any trade links. It hasn't had any any. In fact, it has very important links with the north, and with what later become the Indian regions. Now, in the context of the contemporary relations of Bhutan and it's how we see it as a small country, it isn't, I'm arguing, simply bandwagoning with India. Not even, okay, so conventional IR would expect small states simply to either bandwagon, and if they're weak, they'll simply ally themselves with stronger countries. And Bhutan, and even there's other accounts of it, such as shelter theory. But Bhutan is interesting to look at in this context because what Bhutan is doing is charting its own very interesting trajectory. So if before 1958 visit of Nehru to Bhutan, where he goes on the back of a yak traveling for several days, and it's a choreographed visit, which is really important for diplomacy and lays the foundation for the present enduring idea of friendship. So even after, in the immediate aftermath of that visit, Bhutan was non-committal about taking aid. And throughout the decades between then and now, the idea that India and Bhutan have the exact same interests is simply not the case. I mean, Bhutan has threats not just from the north, but also from the south, and in ways that is probably impossible for me to summarize unless Arunabh asks me some interesting questions. What I'm really saying is that it's not this country that, let me just kind of state the summary of it. It's not just this place that's basically driven by friendship with India, threat from China, and that's it. Its internal dynamics have played a key role, be that like domestic dynamics with the change of governments in say 2013, be that the role of the elite and the National Assembly deliberations in 60s and 70s, be that its own exercise of what was the Driglam Namsha, the policy of cultural homogenization that was conducted in the 80s as a way of consolidating its status. It has been, and in all of its moves, or even not voting along the same lines as India at international fora, being very it has had its own border negotiations with China from 1984 onwards, and there's a kind of history of that. Its stance on Taiwan and on Tibet, which it's very careful of, so it kind of does not explicitly take a stance. So it has its own diplomacy, it has had its own foreign policy. It's that, if we look in detail at how it has chosen to internationalize over time, is driven by more than just, it's going to do whatever India wants it to do, or China is the only threat. And I mean, that's not, I'm not saying that there's anything, I mean, it's not even that I'm saying making a value judgment here about competing ideologies or anything. I'm simply saying the fact that it isn't empirically true that small countries are only, puppets of larger powers, or just driven, they don't have any internal dynamics. There are any number of ways in which it's possible to see this relationship that Bhutan has with its bigger neighbors in more complex terms. Border, trade at the borders, for example, either trade, physical commodity trade, with mountain communities up north, or if we think about the livelihood of migrant workers from the neighboring Indian states who seek their livelihood inside Bhutan. And for example, during the COVID, shutting down of borders, who faced a lot of hardship because Bhutan did not open its borders. It followed a completely different policy towards the pandemic than India and many other countries at the time. So there are all sorts of many complex and multi-dimensional linkages than that this country is simply in between, as well as the fact that in-betweenness has been naturalized over time. Last thing, so I'm interrogating this geopolitical vocabulary that we have got for Bhutan. I'm interrogating where it leads us to, and you can choose to believe me on this or read further. But overwhelmingly, what I am questioning is overwhelmingly the dominant strain of scholarship on how Bhutan gets seen, and that the labor of geopolitics in this region is one key part of this. Inter alia, it's also a reflection on the politics of historiography in the region, where the same sources, correct or not, keep getting reproduced. It's also, in some of my work, a critique of Orientalist stereotypes, which are so powerful. There's a lot of work that questions that for other parts of the world, not nearly as much on Bhutan as I found. So I think I'll just stop there.